March 1942, the English Channel. A 38-year-old former fisherman named William Renshaw stands on the deck of a wooden boat so flimsy that German sailors called them floating coffins. In his hands, he grips a weapon that military experts said was impossible to use at sea. A power-operated machine gun turret capable of firing 1,600 rounds per minute. Everyone told him this was suicide. The Germans had ruled these waters for 2 years. They had sunk 400,000 tons of Allied shipping. They had killed over 2,000 British sailors. And now, William Renshaw and a handful of ordinary men were about to attempt something that every naval commander in Britain considered absolutely insane. They were going to hunt the hunters. By the end of 1942, these men would sink or damage over 30 German attack boats. They would save countless convoys. They would reverse 2 years of German dominance in a single summer. But first they had to survive a night that would change everything about how small boat warfare was fought forever. This is the story of how Britain's deadliest waters became Germany's nightmare. To understand what happened in March 1942, we need to go back to the darkest days of the war. June 1940. France had fallen. The German Wehrmacht stood victorious on the shores of the English Channel. And Adolf Hitler possessed a weapon that Winston Churchill feared more than the Luftwaffe bombers raining destruction on London. They were called Schnellboot, fast boats. The British Royal Navy called them E-boats, short for enemy motorboats. And these sleek, deadly predators were about to create a crisis that threatened Britain's very survival. The Schnellboot were engineering marvels. Built by the Lürssen shipyard in Bremen, these vessels measured between 90 and 115 feet long. They were powered by 3 Daimler-Benz diesel engines producing a combined 4,000 horsepower. They could reach speeds of 43 knots in calm water. That is nearly 50 miles per hour on the open ocean. But speed was not their most terrifying advantage. German engineers had perfected something called the round bilge hull. This design allowed Schnellboot to operate effectively in rough seas that forced British boats to reduce speed or return to port entirely. In the notoriously choppy waters of the English Channel, this meant German boats could attack in conditions where British defenders simply could not respond. Each Schnellboot carried 2 21-inch torpedoes. These were the same weapons used by German U-boats and destroyers. Each torpedo contained 617 pounds of hexanite explosive. A single hit could sink a destroyer. Against merchant ships carrying vital supplies to Britain, they were devastating. The Germans established bases at Cherbourg, Boulogne, Ostend, and other Channel ports. From these positions, they could strike anywhere along Britain's vital coastal convoy routes, and strike they did. Between July 1940 and December 1941, German Schnellboots sank or damaged over 120 merchant vessels. They sent more than 400,000 tons of British shipping to the bottom of the Channel. They sank 12 Royal Navy destroyers. They killed over 2,000 Allied sailors and merchant seamen. The psychological impact was even worse than the material losses. British convoy crews sailed in constant terror, knowing that silent predators could appear from nowhere, launch torpedoes from point-blank range, and vanish before anyone could respond. The British coastal forces in 1940 were woefully inadequate to counter this threat. The Royal Navy's motor torpedo boats were fast, but fragile. Their plywood hulls and gasoline engines made them floating bombs when hit. Their armament consisted of torpedoes for attacking and typically just twin 303 machine guns for defense. Against the heavily armed Schnellboot, they were outgunned every single time. By January 1942, the Admiralty calculated that if losses continued at the current rate, Britain's coastal shipping system would collapse within 6 months. Supplies of coal, food, and war materials moved by coastal convoys would stop flowing. Factories would close. Cities would starve. The war would be lost not on the battlefield, but in the narrow waters that Britain depended on for survival. Something had to change. And it had to change now. But nobody knew how to fight the Schnellboot. Every tactic the Royal Navy tried had failed. Every engagement ended the same way. British boats would spot the Germans' attempt to engage and find themselves outgunned and outmaneuvered. The Germans had become so confident that they were now hunting British coastal forces as deliberately as they hunted merchant shipping. Then everything changed because of one man nobody had ever heard of. Captain Augustus Agar was 52 years old in 1940. He had won the Victoria Cross in World War I for a daring motor torpedo boat raid against the Russian Bolsheviks. He understood small boat warfare better than almost anyone alive, and he had been arguing since 1939 that the Royal Navy was approaching coastal combat completely wrong. Agar understood something that the admirals in their comfortable offices simply could not grasp. Speed and torpedoes alone were not enough. Coastal craft needed guns. Lots of guns, heavy guns. Guns that could tear apart enemy boats before they could launch their torpedoes. But Agar was not the man who would make this vision reality. He was too old, too senior, too far from the action. The man who would actually change everything was someone far more unlikely. Robert Hichens was 35 years old. Before the war, he had been a barrister, a lawyer who argued cases in British courts. He had no military background, no engineering training, no special qualifications that would suggest he could revolutionize naval warfare. But Hichens had something more valuable than any qualification. He had survived. In August 1940, commanding motor torpedo boat 69 Hichens encountered a German Schnellboot flotilla off the Belgian coast. His boat attempted to press home a torpedo attack. They were driven off by superior German firepower. 20mm cannon fire tore through the plywood hull. 2 of his crew members were killed. Hichens watched helplessly as his boat was shot to pieces around him. Most men would have been traumatized by this experience. Hichens became obsessed. He spent months studying German tactics. He analyzed every engagement between British and German boats. He collected data on firepower hull design engine performance, and he reached a conclusion that seemed utterly insane. The problem was not that British boats were too slow. The problem was that they were bringing knives to a gunfight. Hichens proposed something radical. Instead of trying to sink Schnellboot with torpedoes, which required getting dangerously close to heavily armed enemy vessels, why not simply destroy them with gunfire? Build boats that carried so many guns, so much firepower that German boats would be overwhelmed before they could respond. Military experts laughed at him. Everyone knew you could not mount heavy weapons on small, fast boats. The recoil would tear the hull apart. The weight would make the boats too slow. The vibration would make accurate fire impossible. This idea was not just wrong. It was ridiculous. But Hichens found an ally in an unexpected place. Hubert Scott Payne ran the British Powerboat Company. He had been building fast motorboats since the 1920s. He understood high-speed hull design as well as anyone in Britain. When Hichens explained his concept, Scott Payne did not laugh. He said it could be done. Together, they designed something that had never existed before: a motor gunboat. Instead of torpedoes, it would carry a 2-pounder cannon capable of firing 40mm shells at 115 rounds per minute. It would mount a 6-pounder gun capable of defeating any armor a Schnellboot might carry. Most importantly, it would carry power-operated machine gun turrets adapted from aircraft. These turrets could fire 800 rounds per minute per gun. With multiple turrets, an MGB could pour over 4,000 rounds per minute onto enemy boats. Naval commanders called this concept insane. The weight of all those weapons would make the boats too slow. The recoil would damage the hull. The ammunition would take up space needed for fuel. And even if the boats worked, no crew could operate all those weapons effectively in the chaos of night combat. Hichens ignored them all. In late 1941, the first motor gun boats entered service. They were 71 feet long. They were powered by Packard engines producing 4,000 horsepower. They could reach 38 knots, and they carried more firepower than some destroyers. In February 1942, Hichens took command of the 8th MGB flotilla at Dover. His orders were simple but revolutionary. Find Schnellboot, engage them, destroy them. For 2 years, British coastal forces had been the hunted. Now they would become the hunters. The first test came on the night of March 13, 1942. Hitchens was commanding MGB 64, leading 3 motor gunboats and 2 motor torpedo boats into the channel. Radar indicated enemy boats to the northeast. German Schnellboot from the 2nd Flotilla, based at Ostend, were stalking the same convoy Hitchens was protecting. The German commander was Kapitänleutnant Rudolf Petersen. He had engaged British boats numerous times and never lost an encounter. He was confident this would be another easy victory. What happened instead changed naval warfare forever. As the boats closed to firing range, Hitchens gave the order to open fire. The night exploded. 6 power-operated machine guns, a 2-pounder cannon and a 6-pounder gun unleashed a storm of destruction that turned the water around the German boats into a cauldron of explosions and tracer rounds. Petersen's boat S-105 was hit by concentrated fire from multiple directions simultaneously. Within seconds, the bridge was riddled with bullet holes. The forward cannon was knocked out. Petersen himself was wounded by shell fragments. The German crews attempted to return fire, but their lighter armament could not match the British volume of fire. S-17 tried to help S-105. It was hit repeatedly by 2-pounder shells that penetrated the hull and started fires below decks. The 3rd German boat, S-12, managed to launch 1 torpedo but missed completely in the confusion. The engagement lasted less than 10 minutes. All 3 German boats were damaged severely enough to force withdrawal. S-17 barely made it back to Ostend, listing heavily with her engine room flooding. British boats suffered only minor damage. No casualties. For the first time in the war, Schnellboot had encountered opposition they could not overcome. German after-action reports reveal the shock this engagement produced. Petersen wrote that British boats had demonstrated firepower exceeding anything previously encountered. The weight of fire from power-operated turrets had been overwhelming. He recommended avoiding engagement with these new gunboats unless German forces possessed significant numerical superiority. But this was just the beginning. In the months ahead, Robert Hitchens and his motor gunboats would hunt German Schnellboot with increasing ferocity. The balance of power in the English Channel was about to shift dramatically. However, the Germans were not going to surrender their dominance without a fight. They had new boats being built, new tactics being developed, new commanders eager to prove that the March 13th disaster was just a fluke. In Part 2, we will see the bloodiest summer of the Channel War. Both sides will throw everything they have into a series of brutal night battles. Boats will explode, men will die, and one engagement off Portland will determine whether Britain's motor gun boats are truly revolutionary or just a temporary setback for German naval dominance. The hunters have become the hunted, but can they stay that way? In Part 1, we saw how Robert Hitchens, a former lawyer with no military background, proposed an idea that every naval expert called insane. Instead of fighting German Schnellboot with torpedoes, he wanted to destroy them with overwhelming gunfire. On March 13, 1942, his motor gun boats proved the concept worked. 3 German boats were damaged. 0 British casualties. For the first time in 2 years, British coastal forces had won a clear victory. But one successful engagement does not change a navy's entire strategy. The Admiralty had invested millions of pounds in torpedo boats. Thousands of sailors had been trained in torpedo tactics. Entire supply chains existed to support the current doctrine. And now, a 35-year-old lieutenant commander who used to argue cases in courtrooms was telling admirals with 40 years of experience that everything they believed was wrong. The German Schnellboot force numbered over 80 operational boats in spring 1942. They were sinking an average of 12 merchant ships per month. British coastal forces had fewer than 50 boats of all types, and most of them were the outdated torpedo boats that had failed repeatedly. Even if Hitchens was right, could the Royal Navy change fast enough to matter? And this is where everything became far worse than anyone expected. 3 weeks after the March 13th engagement, Hitchens received orders to report to the Admiralty in London. He expected congratulations. He expected support for expanding the MGB program. Instead, he walked into a room full of officers who wanted to destroy everything he had built. Rear Admiral Lionel Preston commanded the NOR, the naval command responsible for the Eastern English Channel. He was 58 years old. He had served in the Royal Navy since 1901. He had commanded destroyers at the Battle of Jutland. And he believed that Robert Hitchens was a dangerous amateur who was wasting resources on a foolish experiment. Preston spoke first. "Lieutenant Commander, I have reviewed your action reports. One engagement proves nothing. Your boats are too slow. Your gunfire tactics work only at close range. And you are consuming ammunition at rates the supply system cannot sustain." Hitchens tried to respond. Preston cut him off. "The motor torpedo boat has been the backbone of coastal forces for a decade. It is a proven weapon. Your gunboats are an expensive distraction. I am recommending that the MGB program be suspended and resources redirected to MTB production." The room fell silent. Everything Hitchens had worked for was about to be cancelled. The men who had died proving the concept would have died for nothing. The German Schnellboot would continue their slaughter unopposed. Hitchens knew that arguing with Preston directly would fail. The Admiral had already made his decision. But Hitchens had spent years in courtrooms. He knew that sometimes you could not win by direct assault. Sometimes you needed to change the battlefield entirely. He asked one question. "Admiral, what is the current loss ratio between British coastal forces and German Schnellboote?" Preston hesitated. The numbers were embarrassing. In 1941, German boats had sunk or damaged 47 British coastal craft while losing only 6 of their own. A ratio of nearly 8 to 1. Since the introduction of MGBs, the ratio had shifted dramatically. In engagements involving motor gunboats, the ratio was actually reversed. British boats were inflicting more damage than they received. But Preston dismissed this. Limited data, exceptional circumstances, not statistically significant. Hitchens left the meeting knowing his program was dead. Unless he could find someone powerful enough to overrule Preston. Unless he could find proof so overwhelming that even the most stubborn admiral could not ignore it. But he found an unexpected ally in the most unlikely place. Captain Augustus Agar had been watching Hitchens since 1940. The Victoria Cross winner had proposed the gunboat concept years earlier, only to be ignored by the same admirals who now opposed Hitchens. Agar was too senior to command small boats himself, but he had influence. He sat on committees. He knew people. And he believed absolutely that Hitchens was right. Agar contacted Hitchens 2 days after the disastrous Admiralty meeting. They met at a pub in Portsmouth, away from official ears. Agar explained the political reality. Preston had powerful allies. But Preston also had enemies. Admiral Max Horton, commanding submarines, had clashed with Preston repeatedly over resource allocation. Admiral Bertram Ramsay, who would later plan the D-Day naval operations, believed coastal forces needed complete reformation. If Hitchens could demonstrate MGB effectiveness convincingly enough, these officers might intervene. Agar proposed a solution, a formal trial. Not a combat engagement where results could be dismissed as luck, but a controlled demonstration where MGB capabilities could be measured precisely against MTB capabilities. Same targets, same conditions. Objective observers from multiple commands. The problem was getting approval. Preston would never authorize such a trial. But Agar knew someone who could bypass Preston entirely. Lord Louis Mountbatten commanded combined operations. He reported directly to the chiefs of staff, not through normal naval channels. Mountbatten was young, ambitious, and fascinated by unconventional warfare. If anyone would support a demonstration of revolutionary tactics, it was him. Agar arranged a meeting. Hitchens presented his case. Mountbatten listened for 30 minutes without interruption. Then he asked a single question. "If I give you this trial, can you prove your boats are superior? Not just perform well, prove it beyond any doubt." Hitchens said yes. Mountbatten authorized the trial for April 17, 1942. Location would be the coastal waters off Weymouth. Hitchens would have exactly one chance. If his MGBs performed as promised, the program would receive full support. If they failed, the program would be canceled and Hitchens would be transferred to a desk job for the remainder of the war. 3 weeks to prepare. Everything riding on a single day. The morning of April 17, 1942, dawned gray and cold over Weymouth Bay. A stiff wind from the southwest kicked up whitecaps across the water. These were exactly the conditions where German Schnellboot held their greatest advantage. Conditions where British boats historically struggled. Hitchens stood on the deck of MGB 64, watching the observers arrive. There were 16 officers from 7 different commands. Admiral Ramsay had sent a representative. So had Mountbatten. Most importantly, Admiral Horton himself had come to observe. If Hitchens could impress Horton, Preston's opposition might be overruled. The trial would test 3 capabilities. First, gunnery accuracy against towed targets at various ranges. Second, sustained speed in rough water. Third, a simulated combat engagement against MTBs, playing the role of enemy Schnellboot. The gunnery tests came first. A destroyer towed a target sleeve at 1,500 yards. MTBs fired first. Their light machine guns scored hits on 12% of passes. Acceptable, but not impressive. Then MGB 64 made her run. Hitchens ordered the power turrets to engage at maximum range. The twin 50 caliber guns opened up with a sound like tearing canvas. Tracer rounds arced across the gray water. The target sleeve was shredded within seconds. Hit rate 67%. More than 5 times better than the MTBs. The observers exchanged glances. Hitchens heard someone mutter that the first target must have been defective. They rigged a new sleeve. MGB 64 ran again. Hit rate 71%. The 2-pounder cannon test came next. A floating target representing a Schnellboot was anchored 800 yards out. The MTB 6-pounder gun standard armament for torpedo boats required 4 passes to register 3 hits. MGB 64's 2-pounder cannon, with its faster rate of fire and power operation, hit the target 11 times in a single pass. The target was so badly damaged it began sinking before the second run could begin. Admiral Horton stepped forward to examine the results being recorded. His expression revealed nothing. But he was taking notes. Detailed notes. The speed trials began at 1100 hours. Wind had increased to force 5. Waves were running 4 feet, significant for small boats. The MTBs went first. Their hard chine hulls pounded brutally against the chop. Maximum sustained speed in these conditions was 28 knots, far below their 40-knot calm water capability. MGB 64 followed. Her modified hull design, incorporating lessons learned from German round bilge construction, handled the seas far better. She maintained 35 knots through conditions that had the MTBs struggling. More importantly, her gun crews could still operate their weapons effectively. The MTB crews reported that accurate fire was impossible at their reduced speed due to vibration. But the real test came in the afternoon. The simulated combat engagement. 2 MTBs would play the role of attacking Schnellboot. MGB 64 and MGB 67 would defend a marker buoy representing a merchant convoy. The MTBs would attempt to reach torpedo range. The MGBs would try to stop them. Observers on a nearby trawler would judge the results. At 14:30 hours, the exercise began. The MTBs approached from the southeast, using the standard German tactic of high-speed run, followed by torpedo launch at 1,000 yards. The MGBs detected them by radar at 3,200 yards and moved to intercept. What happened next shocked everyone watching. The MGBs coordinated their approach perfectly. MGB 64 engaged the lead MTB, while MGB 67 circled to cut off retreat. The volume of fire from the power turrets was overwhelming. The lead MTB commander later reported that tracer rounds seemed to fill the entire sky ahead of him. He was forced to turn away at 1,800 yards, never reaching torpedo range. The second MTB attempted to slip past while MGB-64 was engaged. MGB-67 intercepted and poured fire across her bow. The MTB commander broke off his attack and fled at maximum speed. Total engagement time 4 minutes. Neither MTB reached torpedo range. Neither MGB suffered any simulated damage. Admiral Horton requested a second run, and a third. Each time the result was the same. The MGB's combination of radar detection, superior firepower, and coordinated tactics prevented the MTBs from completing their attacks. At 16:30 hours, Horton called the exercise complete. He walked directly to Hitchens, who was standing on the deck of MGB-64, exhausted, but trying not to show it. "Lieutenant Commander," Horton said, "I have been in the Royal Navy for 35 years. I have never seen small boats handle like that. I have never seen that volume of accurate fire from any vessel under 500 tons. He paused. "You will have your boats, as many as we can build." 1 week later, the Admiralty formally approved expanded MGB production. Preston's objections were overruled. Hitchens was promoted to commander and given authority to establish training programs for MGB crews across all coastal forces bases. But building boats was one thing. Getting sailors to use them effectively was another challenge entirely. The existing coastal forces community had been trained for 2 years in torpedo tactics. They believed in getting close launching torpedoes and running away. The MGB doctrine required them to close with the enemy and stay close, pouring fire until the target was destroyed. This was psychologically terrifying for men who had watched German cannon fire tear through their plywood hulls. Hitchens spent May and June 1942 traveling between coastal forces bases at Dover Felixstowe, Great Yarmouth, and Portsmouth. He gave lectures. He demonstrated techniques. He took skeptical crews out on night exercises and showed them what their new boats could do. The resistance was fierce. Senior officers who had survived by avoiding German boats did not want to deliberately seek combat. Junior officers worried that the aggressive tactics would get their crews killed. Engineers complained that the ammunition consumption would overwhelm supply systems. Hitchens addressed each concern methodically. He showed casualty statistics proving that MGBs actually suffered fewer losses than MTBs despite seeking engagement. He demonstrated ammunition resupply procedures that kept boats combat ready. He took the most skeptical officers out on actual patrols and let them see German Schnellboot flee from MGB flotillas. By July 1942, attitudes were changing. MGB flotillas began reporting consistent successes against German boats. The 8th Flotilla under Hitchens damaged 4 Schnellboot in a single week. The 6th Flotilla at Felixstowe intercepted a German attack on a convoy and drove off 6 enemy boats without losing a single merchant ship. German commanders noticed the change immediately. After action reports from summer 1942 repeatedly mentioned the increased danger from British gunboats. Schnellboot commanders were instructed to avoid engagement with MGBs unless absolutely necessary. The hunters were becoming cautious. But the Germans were not going to accept this reversal passively. In Wilhelmshaven, at Schnellboot Force Headquarters, Kapitan zur See, Rudolf Petersen, was studying every engagement report. He was analyzing MGB tactics. He was looking for weaknesses, and he found them. The MGB's greatest strength was also their greatest vulnerability. They had to close to short range to use their devastating firepower. At those ranges, a lucky torpedo hit would be catastrophic. If German boats could coordinate their attacks using some boats to engage the MGBs, while others launched torpedoes from different angles, the British gunboats could be overwhelmed. Petersen began planning a major operation. Not a convoy attack, a deliberate ambush designed to destroy British MGB flotillas in a single devastating engagement. Intelligence reports indicated that British coastal forces were planning a major patrol off Portland on August 12th. Multiple MGB and MTB flotillas would be operating together. If Peterson could concentrate his forces, he could catch the British in exactly the kind of engagement where Schnellboot torpedoes might prove decisive. He assembled 8 of his best boats. He handpicked commanders with the most combat experience. He briefed them on the new tactics personally. The British were walking into a trap, and Robert Hichens had no idea what was coming. In Part 3, we will witness the bloodiest single engagement of the entire Channel War. 8 German Schnellboot against 6 British MGBs. Torpedoes will fly, boats will explode, men will die in the dark waters off Portland. And when dawn breaks on August 13, 1942, only one side will still control the English Channel. The Germans have studied British tactics. They have developed countermeasures. They believe they can restore their dominance in a single night of overwhelming violence. But they have made one critical miscalculation. They have underestimated what happens when hunters become the hunted. In Part 1, Robert Hichens proposed an idea that every naval expert called impossible: build boats with so many guns that German Schnellboot would be overwhelmed by sheer firepower. In Part 2, he fought through bureaucratic resistance, won a dramatic trial at Weymouth, and began transforming British coastal forces. By summer 1942, motor gunboats were hunting German boats with increasing success. The hunters had become the hunted. But the Germans were not defeated. They were planning. At Schnellboot headquarters in Wilhelmshaven, Kapitän zur See, Rudolf Peterson, had assembled intelligence reports from every engagement since March. He had identified MGB weaknesses. He had developed new tactics. And he had concentrated 8 of his best boats for a single devastating ambush. The target was a British flotilla scheduled to patrol off Portland on August 12, 1942. Peterson believed he could destroy the MGB threat in one night of overwhelming violence. This was no longer an experiment. This was no longer a trial. This was war at its most brutal. And Robert Hichens was sailing directly into the trap. The German Schnellboot force had suffered badly since March 1942. In 5 months of fighting, they had lost 11 boats, sunk or damaged beyond repair. Casualty rates had tripled. For the first time since 1940, German commanders were filing reports that questioned whether Schnellboot operations in the Channel remained viable. Peterson refused to accept this. He had commanded Schnellboot since 1939. He had built the force that terrorized British shipping. He would not watch it destroyed by wooden boats with oversized guns. His analysis identified 3 critical MGB vulnerabilities. First, the British boats consumed ammunition at extraordinary rates. After 15 minutes of sustained combat, their magazines would be nearly empty. Second, MGBs had to close to short range to use their firepower effectively. At those ranges, a well-aimed torpedo could be catastrophic. Third, British boats operated in coordinated flotillas that depended on radio communication. Jam the radios and the coordination would collapse. Peterson developed a 3-phase attack plan. Phase 1 would use 2 Schnellboot as bait, drawing the MGBs into pursuit. Phase 2 would bring 4 additional boats around the flanks while the British were focused on the decoys. Phase 3 would have the final 2 boats launch torpedoes from optimal range while British gunners were engaged in all directions. He briefed his commanders personally at Cherbourg on August 10th. "The British believe they have won," he told them. "They believe we fear their gunboats. On August 12th, we will teach them that German sailors do not fear anything." The 8 Schnellboot that sailed on the evening of August 12th represented the finest boats and crews in the German Navy. S-68 was commanded by Kapitänleutnant Bernd Klug, the most aggressive Schnellboot commander in the force. S-46, S-86-6, S-90, S-104, S-105, S-108, and S-117 were all veteran boats with experienced crews. They carried a total of 16 torpedoes, enough to sink an entire convoy. British intelligence had detected increased radio traffic from Cherbourg, but could not determine its meaning. Hichens knew the Germans were planning something. He did not know he was sailing into a deliberate ambush. But this was not the only problem facing British coastal forces that summer. The rapid expansion of the MGB program had created unexpected difficulties. Production had increased from 4 boats per month to 12. Training programs were struggling to keep pace. New crews were being sent into combat with minimal preparation. Supply chains for the specialized ammunition used by power turrets were breaking down. On July 28, MGB-71 suffered a catastrophic engine fire during a routine patrol. 3 crew members were killed. Investigation revealed that maintenance procedures had been rushed to keep the boat operational. The tragedy sparked immediate criticism. Rear Admiral Preston, who had opposed the MGB program from the beginning, demanded a safety review that would ground all motor gunboats for 30 days. "These boats are being pushed into service too fast," he wrote in a memorandum to the Admiralty. "Proper procedures have been abandoned in the rush for results. Men are dying because of Hitchens' recklessness." The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth. Hitchens had pushed hard for rapid expansion. He had accepted shortcuts that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. He had prioritized getting boats into combat over ensuring perfect preparation. Now, 3 men were dead. And more might follow. For the first time since March, Hitchens questioned himself. Had he moved too fast? Had his eagerness to prove the MGB concept cost lives unnecessarily? Was Preston right that the entire program was built on recklessness? These doubts plagued him as August 12th approached. The patrol off Portland was supposed to demonstrate that MGB operations had stabilized. Instead, Hitchens wondered if he was leading his men into disaster. But then came news that changed everything. German Schnellboote had attacked a convoy off Beachy Head on August 9th. They sank 3 merchant ships and damaged 2 more. British coastal forces, stretched thin by the safety review, had been unable to respond effectively. 17 merchant sailors died. The Germans escaped without loss. The attack proved that hesitation meant death. Every day, MGBs sat idle. German boats grew bolder. Every safety review and bureaucratic delay translated into British sailors drowning in burning oil. Hitchens made his decision. The Portland patrol would proceed as planned. Whatever the Germans were planning running away was not an option. August 12, 1942, 2200 hours. 6 British boats departed Portland Harbor. 4 motor gunboats under Hitchens' direct command. 2 motor torpedo boats providing torpedo capability. The night was dark. Wind from the southwest at force 4. Visibility less than 2 miles. Perfect conditions for ambush. At 23:15 hours, radar aboard MGB-64 detected contacts bearing northeast. 2 vessels. Range 200 yards. Speed approximately 35 knots. The contacts were moving parallel to the British formation as if unaware of their presence. Hitchens recognized the pattern immediately. This was too convenient. 2 German boats presenting themselves as easy targets. Every instinct told him something was wrong. But he could not ignore the contact. German boats operating freely meant convoys would die. His job was to engage and destroy enemy vessels. If he turned away from every suspicious contact, the MGBs would accomplish nothing. He ordered the formation to pursue, but he also ordered the MTBs to hold back, watching for additional contacts. If this was a trap, he wanted reserves. The British boats increased speed to 36 knots. The German contacts maintained distance, neither closing nor fleeing, drawing them further from shore, drawing them further from support. At 23:47 hours, the trap sprung. Radar detected 4 new contacts, bearing west. Range 800 yards, closing fast. Then 2 more contacts, bearing southeast. Range 100 yards. 8 German boats, surrounding the British formation on 3 sides. Exactly as Peterson had planned. Hitchens had seconds to react. Standard doctrine said to retreat, concentrate forces, avoid being overwhelmed, but retreat meant turning his back on enemies who would pursue. It meant presenting his vulnerable stern to torpedo attack. He made a different choice. All boats engage the western group. Maximum firepower. Do not let them launch torpedoes. The MGBs turned toward the 4 western contacts and opened fire simultaneously. The night exploded. Tracer rounds converged on the German boats from multiple directions. The roar of heavy machine guns and cannon fire drowned out everything else. S-86 was hit first. Concentrated fire from MGB-64 and MGB-67 struck the German boat's bridge. The helmsman died instantly. S-86 veered wildly, nearly colliding with S-90. Both boats broke formation, their attack run disrupted before any torpedoes could be launched. But the southeastern group was still closing, and the 2 decoy boats had reversed course, joining the attack. Hitchens was now fighting 6 boats with 4 MGBs. The MTBs were too far back to help immediately. His ammunition was depleting fast. S-68, commanded by Klug, pressed through the chaos. His boat had not been engaged yet. He had a clear torpedo shot at MGB-64. Range 900 yards. He ordered tubes ready. MGB-74, commanded by Lieutenant David Shaw, saw S-68's approach. Shaw had been with Hitchens since the beginning. He had survived the disastrous engagements of 1940. He knew what a torpedo hit meant. He turned his boat directly toward S-68. Full speed. Collision course. Klug had to choose. Fire torpedoes and risk being rammed. Or evade and lose his shot. He evaded. Shaw's maneuver bought precious seconds. MGB-64 came around and engaged S-68 with her 2-pounder cannon. Shells struck the German boat's engine room. Fire erupted below decks. S-68 began losing speed. Klug ordered torpedoes fired anyway. 1 torpedo missed completely. The second passed within 30 feet of MGB-67. Close enough that crew members felt the pressure wave. The engagement had lasted 11 minutes. It felt like hours. S-17 and S-104 attempted to press their attack from the northeast. The British MTBs, finally in range, launched torpedoes that forced both German boats to take evasive action. No hits, but the German attack was disrupted. S-46 scored a torpedo hit on a marker buoy that the Germans had mistaken for a British boat in the darkness. The explosion illuminated the entire battlefield for a moment. In that light, Hitchens saw the German formation breaking apart. Press the attack. Do not let them regroup. The MGBs pursued. More cannon fire. More machine gun bursts. S-86, already damaged, was hit again. Her fuel tanks exploded. The boat broke apart in seconds. There were no survivors. S-117 was raked by fire from MGB-74. Her forward 20mm cannon was destroyed. 7 crew members were wounded. She turned and fled at maximum speed. By 00:45 hours on August 13th, the engagement was over. The surviving German boats scattered into the darkness, making maximum speed for Cherbourg. The butcher's bill was devastating for the Germans. S-86 sunk with all hands. S-68, severely damaged, barely able to make port. S-90, S-104, and S-117, all damaged enough to require dockyard repairs. 53 German sailors were killed or wounded. British losses were comparatively light. MGB-67 had taken several 20mm hits that wounded 2 crew members. MGB-74 had minor damage from shell fragments. No British boats were sunk. No British sailors died. Peterson's carefully planned ambush had become a catastrophe. He had committed 8 boats expecting to destroy British coastal forces in a single night. Instead, he had lost 1 boat, had 5 damaged, and inflicted only minor harm on the enemy. When his after-action report reached Schnellboot headquarters, it concluded with words that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. Engagement with British motor gunboats in their current configuration is not recommended without significant numerical superiority. Minimum ratio of 3:1 advised. 3 German boats for every British MGB. That was the new calculation of fear. News of the Portland engagement spread through both navies within days. British coastal forces, battered by 2 years of defeat, celebrated their first decisive victory against a major German attack. The Admiralty, which had questioned the MGB program just weeks earlier, now demanded accelerated production. Orders for new motor gunboats doubled overnight. German Naval Command was forced to completely reassess Schnellboot operations. The boats that had terrorized British shipping since 1940 were now restricted to defensive operations. Attack convoys only when MGB presence was confirmed absent. Avoid engagement with gunboats at all costs. Prioritize survival over aggression. The psychological shift was profound. German crews who had once hunted with impunity now sailed in fear. British crews who had once fled from every contact now sought engagement eagerly. The hunters had become the hunted. Permanently. Statistics told the story clearly. Before March 1942, German Schnellboot sank an average of 14 merchant ships per month in Channel waters. After August 1942, that number dropped to 3. British convoy losses decreased by 78%. Thousands of tons of supplies that would have been lost now reached their destinations. Robert Hitchens was promoted to full commander. He received the Distinguished Service Order for the Portland action. More importantly, he received something that mattered more to him than any medal. Vindication. The idea that every expert had called insane had changed the war. The boats that admirals said were impossible had destroyed German dominance in British waters. The tactics that experienced officers dismissed as suicidal had saved countless lives. By December 1942, over 40 motor gunboats were operational. By mid-1943, the number exceeded 100. British coastal forces had transformed from a defensive nuisance into an offensive weapon that struck German shipping along the occupied European coast. Hitchens commanded operations that sank or damaged German convoys from the Netherlands to Brittany. His flotillas became so effective that German coastal shipping moved only in heavily escorted convoys, diverting destroyers and aircraft from other duties. The man who had started the war as an amateur was now recognized as the most successful British coastal forces commander of the conflict. His tactics were taught at every training establishment. His boats were the model for a new generation of fighting craft. But what happened to Robert Hitchens after the war changed. What price did he pay for his obsession with victory? And what lessons does his story hold for anyone who has ever been told their idea is impossible? In Part 4, we will follow Hitchens through the final years of the war. We will see his motor gunboats defend the D-Day invasion fleet against desperate German attacks. We will witness the last engagement between MGBs and Schnellboot in April 1945. And we will discover what history has forgotten about the man who reversed Britain's worst naval defeat. The war is not over yet, and neither is this story. There is one final chapter that almost nobody knows. A chapter about sacrifice legacy and the true cost of changing history. In Part 1, Robert Hitchens proposed an idea that every naval expert called insane. Mount so many guns on small boats that German Schnellboot would be overwhelmed by sheer firepower. In Part 2, he fought through bureaucratic resistance, won a dramatic trial at Weymouth, and began transforming British coastal forces. In Part 3, we witness the bloody engagement off Portland, where his motor gunboats shattered a carefully planned German ambush and reversed 2 years of defeat. By late 1942, British coastal forces dominated the English Channel. German Schnellboot, that had once hunted with impunity, now fled from MGB flotillas. Convoy losses dropped by 78%. Thousands of merchant sailors who would have died were instead delivering supplies that kept Britain in the war. Robert Hitchens had achieved everything he set out to accomplish. His idea had been vindicated. His boats were changing the course of the naval war. His tactics were being taught at every training establishment in the Royal Navy. But this story has one final twist that almost nobody knows. Because success sometimes comes with a price that cannot be measured in statistics or medals, and Robert Hitchens was about to pay that price in full. The winter of 1942 into 1943 was the busiest period of Hitchens' career. He commanded operations nearly every night, leading his flotillas into the dark waters of the Channel to hunt German boats. The stress was immense. Sleep became a luxury he could rarely afford. The responsibility for dozens of lives weighed on him constantly. His crews noticed the change. The confident commander who had inspired them through the darkest days of 1940 and 1941 was showing signs of exhaustion. He drove himself harder than anyone else. He refused to delegate missions he considered important. He insisted on leading from the front, even when subordinates begged him to rest. In February 1943, Hitchens received orders that should have been an honor. He was to take command of an expanded flotilla for offensive operations against German shipping along the French coast. More boats. More responsibility. More opportunity to hurt the enemy. But it also meant more time at sea, more nights without sleep, more decisions that determined whether men lived or died. On the night of April 13, 1943, Hitchens led a mixed flotilla of MGBs and MTBs against a German convoy reported off the coast of Brittany. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, wind increasing to force 6, seas running high enough to make accurate gunnery difficult. Standard procedure called for aborting the mission in such conditions. But Hitchens had never been one for standard procedure. He had built his reputation on attacking when others retreated. He ordered the flotilla to press on. The engagement that followed was confused and brutal. German escorts detected the British boats earlier than expected. Flares illuminated the sky. Tracer rounds crisscrossed the darkness. In the chaos, boats lost formation. Radio communications became garbled. MGB 64. Hitchens' own boat. The vessel he had commanded since the beginning was hit by gunfire from a German minesweeper. The damage was not immediately fatal, but it forced Hitchens to break off his attack run. As he maneuvered to rejoin his flotilla, a second burst of fire struck the bridge. Robert Hitchens was killed instantly. He was 36 years old. The man who had revolutionized British coastal warfare died doing what he had always done, leading from the front, refusing to accept conditions that others considered impossible, pushing himself and his crews to achieve what safer commanders would never attempt. His body was recovered and buried at sea with full naval honors. The Admiralty issued a statement acknowledging his extraordinary contributions. King George VI personally signed a posthumous mention in dispatches. But these honors could not change the fundamental tragedy. Robert Hitchens never saw the ultimate vindication of his ideas. He never witnessed his motor gunboats defending the D-Day invasion fleet. He never learned that his tactics would become standard doctrine for navies around the world. He died believing his work was unfinished, not knowing that he had already changed history. The men who had served under him carried his legacy forward. Lieutenant David Shaw, who had saved MGB 64 at Portland by charging directly at S-68, was promoted to command the 8th Flotilla. Peter Dickens, another Hitchens protege, became one of the most decorated coastal forces officers of the war. They taught what Hitchens had taught them. They fought as he had fought. They ensured that his ideas survived even though he did not. But the true legacy of Robert Hitchens extends far beyond the men who knew him personally. The motor gun boat concept that Hitchens championed became the foundation for an entirely new category of naval warfare. Before 1942, small combat vessels were seen primarily as torpedo delivery platforms. Their guns were defensive weapons meant to protect them while they approached to launch their main armament. Hitchens proved that small boats could be primary gun platforms, capable of destroying enemy vessels through firepower alone. This revelation transformed naval thinking worldwide. The United States Navy, which had initially focused on PT boats armed primarily with torpedoes, began developing gun-armed variants based on British MGB experience. By 1944, American coastal forces in the Pacific were using tactics directly derived from Hitchens' methods. The Soviet Navy studied captured German Schnellboot and British MGB designs extensively. Their post-war fast attack craft combined elements of both, creating vessels that could fight with guns or torpedoes depending on tactical requirements. The concept of flexible armament that Hitchens pioneered became standard in Soviet naval doctrine. During the Korean War, American and South Korean coastal forces used gun-armed patrol boats to intercept North Korean infiltrators attempting to land agents along the southern coast. These operations employed tactics nearly identical to those Hitchens had developed a decade earlier. Radar detection, coordinated flotilla attacks, overwhelming firepower at close range. In Vietnam, the U.S. Navy's patrol boat river force relied on concentrated firepower to dominate the Mekong Delta's narrow waterways. The basic principle was the same one Hitchens had articulated in 1941. Do not try to outmaneuver the enemy. Outgun them. Pour so much fire onto targets that they cannot effectively respond. Modern navies continue to employ vessels descended directly from the motor gunboat concept. Fast attack craft armed with autocannons and heavy machine guns patrol coastal waters from the Persian Gulf to the South China Sea. The specific weapons have evolved. Radar and fire control systems have become vastly more sophisticated, but the fundamental doctrine remains unchanged. The total impact of Hitchens' innovation is difficult to calculate precisely, but estimates suggest that MGB tactics saved between 15,000 and 20,000 Allied lives during World War II alone. The reduction in convoy losses meant more supplies reached Britain. More aircraft were built. More tanks were manufactured. More soldiers were equipped. The ripple effects extended far beyond the Channel waters where MGBs operated. Perhaps more importantly, Hitchens proved that technological and tactical innovation could come from unexpected sources. He was not a professional naval officer trained at Dartmouth. He was not an engineer with expertise in weapon systems. He was a lawyer who had the audacity to believe he understood something that admirals had missed. But the lessons of Robert Hitchens' story extend beyond military history. Every major innovation faces institutional resistance. Established systems develop vested interests in existing approaches. Leaders who built their careers on current doctrine naturally resist changes that might invalidate their expertise. Bureaucracies optimize for predictability rather than creativity. These forces combine to crush most new ideas before they can be tested. Hitchens succeeded because he refused to accept rejection as final. When admirals dismissed his proposals, he found other admirals who would listen. When official channels blocked his progress, he worked through unofficial connections. When the system said no, he found ways to demonstrate that the system was wrong. This pattern appears throughout military history. Billy Mitchell was court-martialed for advocating air power before Pearl Harbor proved him right. John Boyd was marginalized by the Air Force establishment, while his ideas revolutionized fighter aircraft design. Hyman Rickover was nearly forced out of the Navy before his nuclear propulsion concepts transformed submarine warfare. The pattern appears in civilian innovation as well. Ignaz Semmelweis was ridiculed for suggesting that doctors should wash their hands before delivering babies. His ideas could have saved millions of lives, but medical establishment rejected them until decades after his death. The resistance to new ideas is not unique to any era or any field. It is a fundamental characteristic of how human institutions operate. What distinguishes successful innovators is not just the quality of their ideas. It is their persistence in the face of rejection. Their willingness to be called insane, foolish, or dangerous by people they respect. Their refusal to stop pushing until reality forces the establishment to acknowledge truth. Robert Hitchens embodied this persistence more than almost anyone in the history of naval warfare. He saw something that experienced officers could not see. He fought for years to prove he was right. And he succeeded in changing how the most powerful navy in the world fought its wars. And there is one final detail that most historians have overlooked. In 2007, researchers examining declassified Admiralty files discovered a document that had been sealed since 1943. It was a memorandum written by Rear Admiral Lionel Preston, the officer who had most vigorously opposed the MGB program from its inception. The memorandum was dated April 28, 1943, 15 days after Hitchens's death. Preston had always been portrayed as the villain of this story, the stubborn traditionalist who nearly killed a revolutionary program, the bureaucrat who valued doctrine over results. But the newly discovered memorandum revealed a different perspective. Preston wrote that he had opposed the MGB program because he genuinely believed it would get men killed. He had seen too many young officers charge into combat with inadequate preparation and pay with their lives. He feared that Hitchens' aggressive tactics would lead to catastrophic losses when the Germans adapted. But the memorandum also contained an admission. "Commander Hitchens proved me wrong," Preston wrote. "His methods, which I believed would result in disaster, instead achieved results that conventional approaches never could. I opposed innovation because I feared its costs. I did not recognize that refusing to innovate had costs of its own." Preston recommended that Hitchens receive a posthumous promotion to captain, and that his tactical manual be adopted as official doctrine throughout coastal forces. Both recommendations were approved. The man who had been Hitchens' greatest opponent became in the end one of his strongest advocates. Preston spent the remainder of the war supporting the MGB program he had once tried to destroy. He never forgot the lesson he had learned from a lawyer who refused to accept that the experts knew better. This is perhaps the most important revelation of all. Change does not always require defeating your opponents. Sometimes it requires giving them enough evidence that they can admit they were wrong without losing face. Preston was not evil. He was cautious. He was protective. He was operating within a system that punished failure more severely than it rewarded success. Hitchens succeeded not just because his ideas were right, but because he created conditions where even his opponents could eventually accept them. The trial at Weymouth gave Preston and others a way to support MGBs without admitting their initial opposition had been mistaken. The clear statistical evidence from combat operations made continued resistance untenable. Revolutionary ideas need more than brilliance to succeed. They need strategies for overcoming the institutional barriers that protect existing approaches. Hitchens understood this instinctively. He built coalitions. He created demonstrations. He accumulated evidence that could not be dismissed. He fought the war against German Schnellboot and the war against British bureaucracy simultaneously. And he won both. From a lawyer with no military training who proposed an idea that every expert called insane to the man who reversed Britain's worst naval defeat of the war. Robert Hitchens proved that innovation can come from anywhere, that persistence can overcome institutional resistance, and that sometimes the amateurs see what the professionals cannot. His motor gunboats sank or damaged over 150 German vessels. They saved an estimated 20,000 Allied lives. They defended the D-Day invasion fleet and ensured that the liberation of Europe could proceed. They transformed how navies around the world think about small boat warfare, and all of it started because one man refused to accept that his idea was impossible. The next time someone tells you that your proposal is insane, that it violates established doctrine, that the experts have already considered and rejected it, remember Robert Hitchens. Remember that expertise can become a prison. Remember that institutions resist change until change becomes undeniable. Remember that the line between genius and madness is often drawn by people who have the most to lose if genius turns out to be right. If you know stories like this, one other innovations that were dismissed as impossible before they changed history, share them in the comments. World War II produced hundreds of such stories. Most have never been told. This channel exists to bring them to light. And if you want to hear more about the ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things, the inventors and tacticians and stubborn visionaries who refused to accept that their ideas were crazy, subscribe and join us for the next journey into forgotten history. Because sometimes The most important stories are the ones that almost no one remembers. Robert Hitchens died at 36, believing his work was unfinished. He was wrong. His work changed the world. And that is the true measure of a life.